Chapter 5. The Dementor. Tom woke the twins the next morning with his usual toothless grin and a tray of tea. Violet got up first to try and make peace with Crookshanks, who had not slept on her stomach last night, as he usually did. She found him brooding underneath the bed, and had a time coaxing him out from there and into his travel carrier. Harry was having just as much trouble persuading a disgruntled Hedwig to get back into her cage when Ron banged his way into the room, pulling a sweatshirt over his head and looking irritable. "The sooner we get on the train, the better," he said. "At least I can get away from Percy at Hogwarts. Now he's accusing me of dripping tea on his photo of Penelope Clearwater. You know," Ron grimaced, "his girlfriend. She's hidden her face under the frame because her nose has gone all blotchy." "I've got something to tell you," Violet heard her brother say, and shot him a warning glare, but fortunately he was interrupted by Fred and George, who had looked in to congratulate Ron on infuriating Percy again. They headed down to breakfast, where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of Thedley Prophet with a furrowed brow, and Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All three of them were rather giggly as Violet made her way to join them. There was little time to speak to anyone in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving all their trunks down the leaky cauldron's narrow staircase and piling them up near the door with Hedwig and Hermes, Percy's screech owl, perched on top in their cages. Violet kept hold of Crookshank's carrier, not wanting to leave him out of her sight for even a moment. "It's all right, Crooks," she muttered soothingly to him. "I'll let you out on the train." Ron, who was standing nearby, shot Violet a scowl but said nothing. Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the ministry cars, stuck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Violet, Harry, come on." Mr. Weasley marched the twins across the short stretch of pavement toward the first of two old-fashioned dark green cars, each of which was driven by a furtive-looking wizard wearing a suit of emerald velvet. "In you get, children," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Violet looked longingly at the car containing Ginny, Mrs. Weasley, and the twins, but silently got in beside her brother without a fuss. The two of them were joined shortly by Ron, Hermione, and to Ron's disgust, Percy. The journey to King's Cross was very uneventful compared with Harry and Violet's trip on the night bus. The Ministry of Magic cars seemed almost ordinary, though Violet noticed that they could slide through gaps that Uncle Vernon's company car certainly couldn't have managed. They reached King's Cross with 20 minutes to spare. The ministry drivers found them trolleys, unloaded their trunks, touched their hats in salute to Mr. Weasley, and drove away, somehow managing to jump to the head of an unmoving line at the traffic lights. Mr. Weasley kept Violet and Harry close to each of his elbows all the way into the station. "Right then," he said, glancing around them. "Let's do this in pairs, as there are so many of us. I'll go through first with Harry." "Percy with Violet, if you please." Percy immediately stepped up beside Violet and placed a firm hand on her shoulder, nodding dutifully to his father. Violet, unhappy at being touched, stood and seethed as she watched Harry and Mr. Weasley casually vanish into the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. "Onward, then," said Percy importantly, practically steering Violet toward the solid wall. She gripped the trolley handle tight as they approached, blinked, and in less than a moment they had passed through the barrier onto platform 9 3/4 and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine, puffing smoke over a platform packed with witches and wizards seeing their children onto the train. Mr. Weasley and Harry were standing a short distance away waiting for them. Violet jogged over to her brother, but Percy had shifted his attention further down the platform. "Ah, there's Penelope," said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Harry caught Violet's eye, and they both turned away to hide their laughter as Percy strode over to a girl with long, curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so that she couldn't miss his shiny badge. Once the remaining Weasleys and Hermione had joined them, Harry and Ron led the way to the end of the train, past packed compartments, to a carriage that looked quite empty. They loaded the trunks onto it, stowed Hedwig and Crookshanks in the luggage rack, then went back outside to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, then Hermione, and finally Harry and Violet. They were both embarrassed, but really quite pleased when she gave them each an extra hug. "Do take care, won't you, dears?" she said as she straightened up, her eyes oddly bright. Then she opened her enormous handbag and said, "I've made you all sandwiches. Here's you are, Ron." "No, they're not corned beef. Fred, where's Fred?" "Here you are, dear." "Harry, Violet," said Mr. Weasley quietly, "come over here a moment." He jerked his head toward a pillar, and the twins followed him behind it, leaving the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. "There's something I've got to tell you before you leave," said Mr. Weasley in a tense voice. "It's all right, Mr. Weasley," said Harry. "We already know." "You know? How could you know?" We heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night," said Violet guiltily. "We didn't mean to." "Sorry, that's not the way I'd have chosen for you to find out," said Mr. Weasley, looking anxious. "No, honestly, it's okay," Violet went on. "This way you haven't broken your word to Fudge, and we know what's going on." "Violet, Harry, you must be very scared. We're not," said Harry sincerely. He reached down and grabbed hold on Violet's hand. "Really?" he added, because Mr. Weasley was looking disbelieving. "I'm not trying to be a hero, but I can look after myself and my sister, and seriously, Sirius Black can't be worse than Voldemort, can he, Mr.?" Weasley flinched at the sound of the name, but overlooked it. "Children, I knew you were, well, made of stronger stuff than Fudge seems to think, and I'm obviously pleased that you're not scared. But Arthur," called Mrs. Weasley, who was now shepherding the rest onto the train. "Arthur, what are you doing? It's about to go." "They're coming, Molly," said Mr. Weasley, but he turned back to the twins and kept talking in a lower and more hurried voice. "Listen, I want you both to give me your word that we'll be good and stay in the castle," said Harry gloomily. "Not entirely," said Mr. Weasley, who looked more serious than the twins had ever seen him. "Harry, Violet, swear to me you won't go looking for Black." Violet stared. "What?" There was a loud whistle. Guards were walking along the train, slamming all the doors shut. "Promise me, you two," said Mr. Weasley, talking more quickly still, "that whatever happens, why would we go looking for someone that wants to kill us?" said Harry blankly. "Swear to me that whatever you might hear, Arthur, quickly," cried Mrs. Weasley. Steam was billowing from the train. It had started to move. Harry and Violet ran to the compartment door and ran through it open and stood back to let them on. They leaned out of the window and waved at Mr. and Mrs. Weasley until the train turned a corner and blocked them from view. "I need to talk to you in private," Harry muttered to Ron and Hermione as the train picked up speed. "Go away, Ginny," said Ron. "Oh, that's nice," said Ginny huffily. "Come with me," Violet said quickly before she could stalk off. "I was going to look for my friends Care to join me." A smile immediately lit up Ginny's freckled face, and she joined Violet in wandering up the corridor, looking for Tracy and Cass, or, at the very least, an empty compartment. They found neither, and ended up doubling back the way they'd came, all the way down to the very end on the train. Violet was just about to give up when the compartment door beside her slid open, and a loud screech came from within. "Found you," said Tracy Davis, flinging herself out at Violet, who only barely managed to catch her in a hug. "Took you long enough, too. We saw Harry pass by earlier, but he said you'd gone looking for us, and we thought about going to look for you, but the train is already so full. Cass was worried someone might try to take our car. Are you gonna let her in or not?" Cassius called from inside the compartment. Tracy laughed and tried to pull Violet along inside, but Violet held back a moment. "This is Ginny Weasley," she said, nudging Ginny into view. "She's my friend. Do you mind if she sits with us?" Tracy and Cass both nodded enthusiastically, and Ginny, pink-faced and stammering thanks, joined the three of them in the compartment. They chatted for a bit, making small talk and introductions, and settling in together. Violet made sure the compartment door was firmly shut before fulfilling her promise to let Crookshanks out. He sprang out as soon as the carrier door was open and leapt into Tracy's lap. "He's still angry with me," Violet said, frowning sadly. I had to shout at him last night for nearly eating Ron's pet rat again. It wouldn't have done him any good, Ginny said, scrunching her nose up. Scabbers is skin and bones as it is, and he's been getting worse ever since we got back from Egypt. Ron's worried he's going to kick it any day now. That's horrible, said Tracy. Poor little rat. Maybe the heat was too much for him. He didn't seem bothered while we were there, even though he'd almost get lost in a pyramid. Ron dropped him while he was running away from a horrible mummy or something. I don't know what it was. Mum wouldn't let me in to see. Why not? Cass asked. The top of Ginny's cheeks and the bridge of her freckled nose went bright pink. She didn't want me to get scared, she muttered. The whole place was supposedly full of mutated muggles who tried to break in and steal the treasure buried with the mummies. And if Ron was scared, I suppose it must they've been bad. But Mum's been really sensitive about upsetting me after, Last year. Last year meaning, of course, the nightmare that Ginny had lived while under the influence of Lord Voldemort himself, or whatever was left of him, in the form of his childhood diary. Thanks to Lucius Malfoy, the father of Violet and Harry's arch-rival, Draco, the diary had come into an unaware Ginny's possession and proceeded to warp and take over her mind. She was forced to write cryptic warnings on the walls and set an ancient basilisk on Muggle-born students, until she herself was eventually taken into the Chamber of Secrets. Ginny had confided in Violet about the diary's power, but neither of them had understood how truly dangerous it was until it was too late. When Violet herself was petrified by the basilisk, it was Harry who ventured into the Chamber of Secrets, slew the monster, destroyed Voldemort's diary, and rescued Ginny at the end of the last school year. It was a lot to take in, and certainly more than any 11-year-old should have to face. Violet completely understood why Mrs. Weasley would be even more protective than usual of her youngest child and only daughter. But the mention of loads of dead muggles jogged another memory in Violet's mind. He killed 13 people with a single curse. Violet, Tracy's hand reached across the aisle, gently resting over Violet's own. Sorry, said Violet, did I miss something? No, but you were just sort of staring, Tracy said. Are you all right? Yeah, I'm fine. Violet winced at her own automatic lie. Well, no, actually, I'm not fine. Sorry, I'm so used to look. There's something I need to tell you about. Violet was cut off by the compartment door sliding open suddenly, and Ron stepped inside, carrying a glowing, spinning top in his hand. It was emitting a high, tinny sort of whistle. Here, can you do anything about this? He said, shoving the thing toward Violet, who took it in both hands, confused. Isn't this Harry's? Yeah, I got it for him in Egypt, said Ron. S'pose it's broken or something, it keeps buzzing at nothing. What is it? Violet asked. It's a sneakoscope. It's meant to tell you when someone untrustworthy's around. Mind you, it's a very cheap one, said Ron. It went higher just now, and all we're doing is sitting around and talking. Harry's worried it'll wake up the bloke in our compartment. What? I know, I don't think it's making that much noise. No, Ron, what bloke? Where are you sitting? Oh, Ron's ears went pink. Just next door. Violet jumped to her feet and pushed past Ron into the corridor. The next door over was open as well, and inside she found Harry, Hermione, an empty seat that presumably belonged to Ron, and, leaning fast asleep against the window, was a man that Violet had never seen before. She checked on the threshold. The Hogwarts Express was usually reserved for students, and she had never seen an adult there before, except for the witch who pushed the food cart. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes that had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted. Though quite young, his light brown hair was flecked with grey. Hey, Roman 6, said Harry quietly, looking at her in surprise. Is something the matter? Violet pointed at the strange man. Who is that? She hissed. Why are you sitting in here with him? Professor R.J. Lupin, said Hermione at once, pointing up to the luggage rack above the man's head, where there was a small, battered case held together with a large quantity of nearly knotted string. The name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across one corner in peeling letters. Everywhere else was full, Harry said simply, shrugging. He's been asleep the whole time anyways. He's not bothering us. But what's Hedwinger? Violet insisted. She felt a strange panic, seeing a grown man traveling in a train full of children with no warning, not even taking a private compartment to himself. The sight of him in his dingy robes and scuffed shoes made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, though she couldn't explain why. She stuck out her other hand toward him, which was still holding Harry's pocket sneakoscope, and glared at her brother when the thing lit back up and started spinning again. "Oh, come on," said Ron, appearing behind her. "We've been trying not to wake him up. Take it back to your cabin," Harry whispered fiercely, closing Violet's hand around the whining top and trying to push her back out the door. "But Harry, look, it's fine. He's a professor. He's not going to do anything to us. I'll remember that next time you think Snape's out to get you," Violet warned, allowing herself to be shoved into the corridor. Harry scowled. He stepped aside to let Ron back in before closing the door in her face. Violet was left alone in the corridor, watching the sneakoscope slowly die down and come to a halt in her open palm. She shook it slightly, and when it failed to respond, jammed the thing into her pocket and went back to her own compartment. "What was all that about?" asked Cassius, no longer slumped across the seat. "There's a man in Harry's compartment." "Oh, weird," Tracy said, frowning. "Like an adult. What's he doing on the train?" "His case says he's a professor," Violet told them, "and Harry seems to think that makes it all fine to have him around. I've never seen a professor on the train before, have you?" Tracy, Cass, and Ginny all shook their heads. After a moment, Tracy said, "So, what were you going to tell us about?" Violet explained all about Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's argument and the warning Mr. Weasley had given her and Harry. When she'd finished, Cass looked thunderstruck and Ginny's face had gone very white, and Tracy had her hands over her mouth. She finally lowered them to say, "Sirius Black escaped to come after you." "Oh, Violet, you must be so frightened. You've got to be really, really careful. You can't go looking for trouble. Why does everyone keep saying that to me?" said Violet, nettled. "It's not like I go running straight toward things that want to kill me. Usually they come running at me." "I know, but you can't go wandering off alone anymore. I don't go wandering off alone," Violet protested, flushing slightly because she knew that wasn't entirely true. Several times she'd gotten herself into sticky situations by sneaking out at night, by herself, without telling anyone where she was going. It was just easier that way, she told herself. But with the way Tracy was looking at her now, "But it's just Harry he's after, isn't it?" said Cass suddenly. "Harry's the one who stopped, you know. Who, not you? Why would Black want to kill you if you had nothing to do with it?" "I was there, too, Cassius," Violet said, now more than a little angry. "Voldemort wanted to kill me, too." Everyone else flinched visibly at the name. "We don't even know why he wanted us dead, but he wanted to kill us both. It was chance that he picked Harry to kill first over me. We were babies then, and we're just kids now. Harkers we Black wants us dead. Everyone says he's a madman. He just does." There was silence as Violet's words sank in, ringing off the walls of the compartment. She was breathing hard, and her hands were clenched at her sides. Her friends were taking the news worse than Violet expected. "No one knows how he got out of Azkaban," said Cass uncomfortably, not meeting Violet's eyes. "No one's ever done it before. And he was a top security prisoner, too, not like—" Cass cut himself off suddenly. He stared at the floor, frowning. "But they'll catch him, won't they?" said Tracy earnestly. "I mean, they've got all the muggles looking out for him too. My dad and I saw him on the evening news before we even found out he was a wizard." "Dad keeps saying the Azkaban guards will get him," said Ginny quietly. "He says they're really angry." Cass shuddered. Another long silence stretched between them, becoming more uncomfortable by the second, until Tracy cleared her throat and said loudly, "So, who's excited for Hogsmeade?" "Oh, you'll love it," said Cass, brightening up and grinning at her. "Wait till you've seen Honeydukes." "What's that?" said Tracy. "Only the best sweets shop in Britain," Cass said smugly. "They've goat everything there." pepper imps and great fat chocoballs full of strawberry mouse and clotted cream, and really excellent sugar quills better than the ones the Weasley twins got you last year. Violet, they last forages. Oh, Cass, stop it. You're making me hungry, Tracy whined. But Cassius only went on louder. And massive sherbet balls that make you levitate a few inches off the ground while you're sucking them, and Drooble's best blowing gum. That's my favorite. It makes loads of little blue bubbles that won't pop for days. Mother won't let me chew it in the house anymore. Tracy clapped her hands over her ears and groaned loudly as Cass went on describing all manner of sweets and confections. He was grinning all the while, but Violet's heart had sank into her stomach since the very first mention of Hogsmeade. It must have showed on her face as well, because Ginny nudged her softly in the arm. "Aren't you excited too?" she asked quietly. "Fred and George have told me loads about Hogsmeade, but I've never been either." "I suppose I'll have to get them to tell me about it too," Violet said, smiling bitterly. When Ginny looked confused, she sighed and leaned in to mutter, "The Dursleys didn't sign our permission slips." "Harry and I can't go." Ginny looked stricken. "But that's awful," she said, and was fortunately drowned out by the sound of Tracy thwacking Cassius repeatedly on the arm for continuing to tease her. "Can't someone else give you permission? Dumbledore or Professor Snape?" The idea had never occurred to Violet. As head of Slytherin House, Professor Snape was in a position of authority over her, and had once told her it was his duty to look after the students in his care. Maybe she could remind him of that, and convince him to sign the forms, or her form, at least. Violet doubted very much that Professor Snape would do anything to help Harry, who wasn't in his house, and whom he seemed to greatly dislike. "And if he won't," said Ginny, dropping her voice to even lower conspiratorial levels, "let me know, and I'll put in a word with Fred and George. They knows loads of secret passages in and out of the castle." Thank you, Ginny," Violet said, processing. "I might just take you up on that." The Hogwarts Express moved steadily north, and the scenery outside the window became wilder and darker while the clouds overhead thickened. People were chasing backward and forward past the door of their compartment. Crookshanks had now settled in the empty seat to Violet's left, not touching her and not purring, but it was closer than he'd gotten all day. At 1 o'clock, the plump witch with the food cart arrived at the compartment door. Tracy finally got her hands on some of the sweets Cassius had got her craving, and Violet bought plenty of cauldron cakes and chocolate frogs to go around. She had to press extras into a flustered Ginny's hands. The rain thickened as the train sped yet further north. The windows were now a solid, shimmering grey, which gradually darkened until lanterns flickered into life all along the corridors and over the luggage racks. The train rattled, the rain hammered, the wind roared, but Violet was still comfortable and cozy with her friends and her food. "We must be nearly there," said Cass, peering out the now completely black window. The words had hardly left him when the train started to slow down. "Great," said Cass, standing up to stretch into front of the window. "I can't wait to get to the feast. I've really missed the food at school, you know." "We can't be there yet," said Tracy, checking her watch. The band was wrapped in brightly colored string and tiny beads, and she had likely made it herself. "So why are we stopping?" The train was getting slower and slower. As the noise of the pistons fell away, the wind and rain sounded louder than ever against the windows. Violet, who was nearest the door, got up to look into the corridor. "What's going on?" she heard Harry's voice ask from beside her, and saw his head sticking out into the corridor as well. "I don't know," Violet said. "I was hoping you or somebody else did." The train came to a stop with a jolt, and distant thuds and bangs told them that luggage had fallen out of the racks. Then, without warning, all the lamps went out, and they were plunged into darkness. "Violet," said Harry's voice from beside her, and she felt a hand grasping at her shoulder. "Come on, come in here with me." "But my friends, please, Romans 6, they can come too." "Tracy," Violet said, turning around to speak blindly into the black compartment behind her. "Cass, Ginny. Do you want to come with me into Harry's compartment? Do you think we've broken down?" said Tracy's voice, high with uncertainty and nerves. There was a soft shuffle as the three of them stood up, groping blindly for Violet and the door. They all eventually made their way out into the corridor and then squeezed their way into the other compartment with Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Who's that?" said Hermione. "It's just us," Ginny said. "Sorry, do you know what's happening? There's something moving out there," Ron said from somewhere by the window. "I think people are coming aboard." "People," Violet squeaked, panic gripping her. "What people? What's happening?" "Come sit by me," said Harry, tightly taking hold of her hand. "And the rest of you, come in and sit down." There was another moment of awkward shuffling, following by a thud and two loud squeals of pain. "Who's that? Who's that?" "Tracy. Hermione." I'm sorry, I can't see anything. It's all right here, come and sit here." "Not here," said Ron hurriedly. "I'm here." "Ouch," said Violet, as someone trod painfully on her foot. "Quiet," said a hoarse voice suddenly. Violet suddenly remembered the man in the compartment. Professor Lupin appeared to have woken up at last. She could hear his movements in the corner. None of them spoke. There was a soft, crackling noise, and a shivering light filled the compartment. Professor Lupin appeared to be holding a handful of flames. They illuminated his tired, grey face, but his eyes looked alert and wary. "Stay where you are," he said in the same hoarse voice, and he got slowly to his feet with his handful of fire held out in front of him. But the door slid slowly open before Lupin could reach it. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the shivering flames in Lupin's hand, was a cloaked figure that towered to the ceiling. Its face was completely hidden beneath its hood. Violet's eyes darted downward, and what she saw made her stomach contract. There was a hand protruding from the cloak, and it was glistening, graying, slimy-looking, and scabbed, like something dead that had decayed in water. But it was visible only for a split second. As though the creature beneath the cloak sensed Violet's gaze, the hand was suddenly withdrawn into the folds of its black cloak. And then the thing beneath the hood drew a long, slow, rattling breath, as though it were trying to suck something more than air from its surroundings. An intense cold swept over them all. Violet felt her own breath catch in her chest. Harry's hand went slack in her grip. The cold went deeper than her skin. It was inside her chest. It was inside her very heart. Violet's vision went blurry. Her eyes rolled up into her head. She couldn't see. She was drowning in cold. There was a rushing in her ears as though of water. She was being dragged downward, the roaring growing louder. And then, from far away, she heard screaming, terrible, terrified, pleading screams. She wanted to help whoever it was. She tried to move her arms, but couldn't. A thick white fog was swirling around her, inside her. "Violet! Violet, wake up!" Someone was shaking her. Violet opened her eyes. There were lanterns above her, and the floor was shaking. The Hogwarts Express was moving again, and the lights had come back on. She was slumped in her seat, leaning on Harry's shoulder just as heavily as he was leaning on hers. His mouth was open, but his eyes were closed. Ron and Hermione were kneeling in front of him, and Tracy was standing over Violet, eyes wide and panicked. Behind her, Violet could see Cass, Ginny, and Professor Lupin watching. "Harry," Violet said, only her voice came out very weakly. She coughed and tried again, turning toward her brother and giving him a few sharp pats on the cheek. "Harry, Harry, are you all right?" Harry's eyes shot open with a gasp. He pushed himself up in his seat, looking blankly at the compartment around him. Violet pushed his glasses back into place and felt the cold sweat on his skin. "What's happened?" he said faintly. Immediately he looked Violet over. "Was that thing? Are you okay? You were screaming." "No, I wasn't," Violet said. She was feeling very shaky and weak all over. "I heard it too, but it wasn't me. Who screamed?" "No one screamed," said Ron, more nervously still. Violet and Harry looked around the bright compartment. Their friends all looked back at them, looking very pale. Even Tracy and Hermione had a greyish pallor to them. But we heard screaming. A loud snap made them all jump. Professor Lupin was breaking an enormous slab of chocolate into pieces. "Here," he said, passing two particularly large chunks to Violet and Harry. "Eat it. It'll help." They both took the chocolate, but neither of them ate it. Violet looked at it suspiciously before turning the same gaze onto Lupin. "What was that thing?" Harry asked him. "A Dementor," said Professor Lupin, who was now giving chocolate to everyone else. "One of the Dementors of Azkaban." Everyone stared at him. Professor Lupin crumpled up the empty chocolate wrapper and put it in his pocket. "Eat," he repeated. "It'll help. I need to speak to the driver, excuse me." He strolled past Harry and Violet and disappeared into the corridor. "Are you sure you two are okay?" said Hermione, watching them anxiously. "I don't understand. What happened?" said Violet, wiping sweat from her own face. "Well, that thing the Dementor stood there and looked around. I think it did. I couldn't see its face. And I thought you were both having a fit or something," said Ron, who still looked scared. "You went sort of rigid and slumped over and started twitching. And that man stepped over you and walked toward the Dementor and pulled out his wand," said Tracy shakily. "And he said, 'None of us is hiding Sirius Black under our cloaks.' Go." But the Dementor didn't move, so he muttered something, and a silvery sort of thing shot out of his wand at it, and it turned around and sort of glided away. "It was horrible," Cass muttered, his face far paler than usual. "Did you feel how cold it got when it came in?" "I felt weird," said Ron, shifting his shoulders uncomfortably. "Like I'd never be cheerful again." Ginny, who was huddled in her corner looking nearly as bad as Violet felt, gave a small sob. Violet struggled to get up from her seat and went over to put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "But did any of you black out or anything?" said Harry awkwardly. "No," said Ron, looking anxiously between Harry and Violet. Ginny was shaking like mad, though. Violet pulled Ginny closer. She didn't understand. She still felt weak and shivery, as though she were recovering from a bad bout of flu. She also felt confusion and the beginnings of shame. Why had she and Harry gone to pieces like that when no one else had? Professor Lupin had come back. He paused as he entered, looking around, and said, with a small smile, "I haven't poisoned that chocolate, you know." Violet and Harry looked at one another. She watched her brother take a small bite, and to her surprise, seemed to brighten. Harry nodded at her, and Violet took a little nibble off the corner. She immediately felt great warmth spread through her, all the way to the tips of her fingers and toes. "We'll be at Hogwarts in 10 minutes," said Professor Lupin. "Violet, Harry, are you all right?" "How do you know our names?" Violet asked, chest tightening with suspicion once more. Professor Lupin smiled at her, the corners of his tired eyes crinkling in the same kind way that Hagrid's did. And most strangely of all, in the back of Violet's mind, there was something familiar about those eyes. Who else could you be? They didn't talk much during the remainder of the journey. At long last, the train stopped at Hogsmeade Station, and there was a great scramble to get outside. Owls hooted, cats meowed, and somewhere in the crowd Violet could hear a toad croaking loudly. It was freezing on the tiny platform. Rain was driving down in icy shivers. "Furs years this way," called a familiar voice. Harry and Violet turned and saw the gigantic outline of Hagrid at the other end of the platform, beckoning the terrified-looking new students forward for their traditional journey across the lake. "All rig, you lot," Hagrid yelled over the heads of the crowd. They all waved at him, but had no chance to speak to him because of the mass of people around them shunting them away along the platform. Violet, Tracy, and Cassius followed the rest of the school along the platform and out onto a rough mud track, where at least 100 stagecoaches awaited the remaining students, each pulled by the strange, silent, skeletal horses. To Violet's further annoyance and discomfort, Professor Lupin joined the three of them inside the carriage. Though he'd been nothing but kind and polite, there was still something about him that set Violet's teeth on edge. She squeezed up next to Cassius to be as far from Lupin as possible and avoided his eyes as casually as she could. The door had barely closed behind him when the horses set off, bumping and swaying in procession. The coach smelled faintly of mold and straw. Violet felt better since the chocolate, but still weak. Tracy and Cass kept looking at her sideways, as though frightened she might collapse again. Professor Lupin stared politely out the window. As the carriage trundled toward a pair of magnificent wrought iron gates, flanked with stone columns topped with winged boars, Violet saw two more towering, hooded dementors standing guard on either side. A wave of cold sickness threatened to engulf her again. She leaned back into the lumpy seat and closed her eyes until they had passed the gates. The carriage picked up speed on the long, sloping drive up to the castle. Tracy was leaning out of the tiny window, watching the many turrets and towers draw nearer. At last, the skeletal horses came to a halt, carriages swaying, and the three of them hopped out. As Violet stepped down, she heard a drawling, delighted voice sounded from across the way. "You fainted, Potter. Is Longbottom telling the truth? You actually fainted." At the next carriage over, Violet could see her brother walled in by a familiar, pale, rodent-faced boy. Draco Malfoy had been an adversary of both her and Harry since their very first day at Hogwarts, and he'd been nothing but a nuisance for the entire 2 years since. It looked like he was planning to keep that streak alive for a third year, as well, judging by the way he and cronies, Crabbe and Goyle, were blocking Harry's path up the stone stairs into the castle. Violet's shoes squelched loudly as she stomped across the muddy ground. "Shove off, Malfoy," she said, coming up behind him, and was pleased when he whirled around to face her with wide eyes. "Before I make you." Again, Malfoy's eyes narrowed. "Didn't you faint as well?" he said loudly. "Did the scary old Dementor frighten you too? Or maybe you're the one who frightened it with a mug like that." "Is there a problem?" said a mild voice. Professor Lupin had just gotten out of the carriage. Malfoy gave Professor Lupin an insolent stare, which took in the patches on his robes and the dilapidated suitcase. With a tiny hint of sarcasm in his voice, he said, "Oh, no, Professor." Then he smirked at Crabbe and Goyle and led them up the steps into the castle. "I'm sick of him," Violet muttered to Tracy, who prodded her in the back to move her along. The two of them and Cass joined the crowd swarming up the steps, through the giant oak front doors, into the cavernous entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches, and housed a magnificent marble staircase that led to the upper floors. The door into the great hall stood open at the right. Violet followed the crowd toward it, but had barely glimpsed the enchanted ceiling, which was black and cloudy tonight, when a voice called, "Potter, Granger, I want to see you, please." Harry, Violet, and Hermione turned around, surprised. Professor McGonagall, transfiguration teacher and head of Gryffindor House, was calling over the heads of the crowd. She was a stern-looking witch who wore her hair in a tight bun. Her sharp eyes were framed with square spectacles. Violet and Harry looked at each other, then back at her. "Which one?" Harry called back, pointing between himself and Violet. "Both, if you please," said Professor McGonagall, frowning. The twins fought their way over to her with feelings of foreboding. Professor McGonagall had a way of making people feel they must have done something wrong. "There's no need to look so worried. I just want a word in my office," she told them. "Move along, the rest of you." Ron, Tracy, and Cass stared as Professor McGonagall ushered Harry, Violet, and Hermione away from the chattering crowd. They accompanied her across the entrance hall, up the marble staircase, and along a corridor. Once they were in her office, a small room with a large, welcoming fire, Professor McGonagall motioned for the three of them to sit down. She settled herself behind her desk and said abruptly, "Professor Lupin sent an owl ahead to say that you two were taken ill on the train." Before Harry or Violet could reply, there was a soft knock on the door, and Madame Pomfrey, the nurse, came bustling in. Violet felt herself going red in the face. It was bad enough that she'd passed out, or whatever had happened, without everyone making all this fuss. One look at Harry told him he was plainly feeling the same way. "I'm fine," he said. "I don't need anything." "Oh, it's you too, it is," said Madame Pomfrey, ignoring this and bending down to stare closely at him. "I suppose you've been doing something dangerous again." "It was a Dementor, Poppy," said Professor McGonagall. They exchanged a dark look, and Madame Pomfrey clucked disapprovingly. "Setting Dementors around a school," she muttered, moving over to Violet and pressed a hand to her forehead. They won't be last who collapse. Yes, she's all clammy. Terrible things they are, and the effect they have on people who are already delicate. I'm not delicate, said Violet crossly. Of course you're not, said Madame Pomfrey absent-mindedly, frowning at the bruise on Violet's face. What happened here? I fell, Violet said at once. The lie left a bitter taste in her mouth, and she regretted it as soon as it came out, but Madame Pomfrey seemed to have accepted it. She'd already moved on to checking Violet's pulse. What do they need? Said Professor McGonagall crisply. Bed rest. Should they perhaps spend tonight in the hospital wing? Werifine, said Harry, jumping up. The thought of what Draco Malfoy would say if the two of them had to go to the hospital wing sent Violet's face from flushed to crimson. Well, they should have some chocolate at the very least, said Madame Pomfrey, who was now trying to peer into Violet's eyes. We've already had some, said Violet, jerking backwards and blinking. Professor Lupin gave us some. He gave it to all of us. Did he now? Said Madame Pomfrey approvingly. So we've finally got a defense against the dark arts teacher who knows his remedies. Are you too sure you're feeling all right? Professor McGonagall said sharply. Yes, said Harry and Violet together. Very well. Kindly wait outside while I have a quick word with Miss Granger about her course schedule. Then we can go down to the feast together. Violet and Harry went back into the corridor with Madame Pomfrey, who left for the hospital wing, muttering to herself. They had to wait only a few minutes. Then Hermione emerged looking very happy about something, followed by Professor McGonagall, and the three of them made their way back down the marble staircase to the great hall. It was a sea of pointed black hats. Each of the long house tables was lined with students, their faces glimmering by the light of thousands of candles, which were floating over the tables in midair. Professor Flitwick, who was a tiny little wizard with an impressively curled black mustache, was carrying an ancient hat and a three-legged stool out of the hall. Oh, said Hermione softly, we've missed the sorting. New students at Hogwarts were sorted into houses by trying on the sorting hat, which shouted out the house they were best suited to: Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, or Slytherin. Professor McGonagall strode off toward her empty seat at the staff table, and after a brief squeeze of each other's hands for goodbye, Harry and Violet set off in opposite directions, as quietly as possible, toward their respective tables. Harry and Hermione were in Gryffindor, but Violet had been sorted into Slytherin. People looked around at them all as they passed along the back of the hall, and a few of them even pointed. Had the story of their collapsing in front of the Dementor traveled that fast? Violet sat down in between Tracy and Cassius, who had saved her a seat. What was that all about? Cass muttered to Violet. Violet started to explain in a whisper, but at that moment the headmaster stood up to speak, and she broke off. Professor Dumbledore, though very old, always gave off an impression of great energy. He had several feet of long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, and an extremely crooked nose. He was often described as the greatest wizard of the age, but that wasn't why Violet respected him. You couldn't help trusting Albus Dumbledore, and as Violet watched him beaming around at the students, she felt really calm for the first time since the Dementor had entered the train compartment. Welcome, said Dumbledore, the candlelight shimmering on his beard. Welcome to another year at Hogwarts. I have a few things to say to you all, and as one of them is very serious, I think it best to get it out of the way before you become befuddled by our excellent feast. Dumbledore cleared his throat and continued. As you will all be aware after their search of the Hogwarts Express, our school is presently playing host to some of the Dementors of Azkaban who are here in Ministry of Magic business. He paused, and Violet remembered what Mr. Weasley had said about Dumbledore not being happy with the Dementors guarding the school. They are stationed at every entrance to the grounds, Dumbledore continued, and while they are with us, I must make it plain that nobody is to leave school without permission. Dementors are not fooled by tricks or disguises or even items that might render their owners invisible or intangible, he added blandly, and Violet and Tracy glanced at each other. Harry's cloak, and Violet's ring were apparently rendered ineffective against the Dementors. It is not in the nature of a Dementor to understand pleading or excuses. I therefore warn each and every one of you to give them no reason to harm you. I look to the prefects and our new head boy and girl to make sure that no student runs afoul of the Dementors, he said. Violet looked over to the Gryffindor table where Percy, seated a ways down from Harry, had his chest puffed out and was looking around impressively. Dumbledore paused again. He looked very seriously around the hall, and nobody moved or made a sound. On a happier note, he continued, I am pleased to welcome 2 new teachers to our ranks this year. First, Professor Lupin, who has kindly consented to fill the post of defense against the dark arts teacher. There was some scattered, rather unenthusiastic applause. Only those who had been in the compartment on the train with Professor Lupin clapped hair, Violet grudgingly among them. Professor Lupin looked particularly shabby next to all the other teachers in their best robes. Violet's eyes slid down the table on a whim, landing on Professor Snape, the potions master and head of Slytherin House. He was staring along the staff table at Professor Lupin. It was common knowledge that Professor Snape wanted the defense against the dark arts job, but Violet was startled at the expression twisting his thin, pale face. It was beyond anger. It was loathing. Did he know Professor Lupin from outside of school? Did he know something about him? It wasn't until then she remembered that, although the sneakoscope had been in her pocket since Ron gave it to her, it hadn't moved or made a single sound the whole carriage ride with Professor Lupin. As to our second appointment, Dumbledore continued as the lukewarm applause for Professor Lupin died away. Well, I am sorry to tell you that Professor Kettleburn, our care of magical creatures teacher, retired at the end of last year in order to enjoy more time with his remaining limbs. However, I am delighted to say that his place will be filled by none other than Rubeus Hagrid, who has agreed to take on this teaching job in addition to his gamekeeping duties. Violet, Tracy, and Cass stared at one another, stunned. Then they joined in with the applause, which was particularly tumultuous across the hall at the Gryffindor table. Violet leaned forward to see Hagrid, who was ruby-red in the face and staring down at his enormous hands, his wide grin hidden in the tangle of his black beard. We should have known, Tracy squealed, clapping furiously. Who else would have assigned us a biting book? As the clapping finally died down, and as Professor Dumbledore started speaking again, Violet saw that Hagrid was wiping his eyes on the tablecloth. Well, I think that's everything of importance, said Dumbledore. Let the feast begin. It was a delicious feast. The hall echoed with talk, laughter, and the clatter of knives and forks. Violet, however, was eager for it to finish so that she could talk to Hagrid. She knew how much being made a teacher would mean to him. Hagrid wasn't a fully qualified wizard. He had been expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year for a crime he had not committed. It had Harry who had cleared Hagrid's name last year. At long last, when the last morsels of pumpkin tart had melted from the golden platters, Dumbledore gave the word that it was time for them all to go to bed, and they got their chance. Congratulations, Hagrid, Violet cried as she reached the teacher's table, just in time to be joined by Harry, Ron, and Hermione. All down you lot, said Hagrid, wiping his shining face on his napkin as he looked down at them. Can believe it. Great man, Dumbledore. Came straight down me hut after Professor Kettleburn said he'd had enough. It's what I always wanted. Overcome with emotion, he buried his face in his napkin, and Professor McGonagall shooed them away. Violet joined Tracy and Cassius, and the rest of the Slytherins streaming down the winding staircase off of the entrance hall, and very tired now, through several winding corridors, down more and more stairs, to the hidden entrance to the Slytherin dungeons. A black stone wall greeted them, flanked by 2 innocuously burning torches. Coming through, pardon me, said an unfamiliar female voice, and a tall, very thin black girl with short-cropped hair pushed to the front of the crowd. Violet recognized her as an older student she'd seen around the common room, and now saw the shiny prefect badge pinned to the front of her robes. She remembered, suddenly and sadly, that Gemma Farley had graduated at the end of last year. "I'm Zoe Crington. I'll be one of your prefects this year. The new password to our common room is Octoritas." The wall behind her melted away, revealing a solid wooden door beneath. It opened soundlessly, and the whole house streamed into through the doorway and across the common room. The girls and boys divided toward their separate staircases. Violet jogged down the steps with no thought in her head except how glad she was to be back. They reached their familiar, long and low dormitory with its 5 four-poster beds, and Violet, looking around, felt she was home at last. Chapter 6. Numerology and Grammatica. When Violet and Tracy entered the great hall for breakfast the next day, the first thing they saw was Draco Malfoy, who seemed to be entertaining a large group of younger students with a very funny story. As they settled into seats further down the table, Malfoy did a ridiculous impression of a swooning fit, and there was a roar of laughter. "Ignore him," said Tracy, who was right behind Violet. "Just ignore the prat. Don't give him the satisfaction." "Hey, Potter," shrieked Pansy Parkinson, a girl in Violet and Tracy's year. "Potter, the Dementors are coming, Potter. Woo-woo." Violet kept her eyes resolutely forward and dug into her muesli. A few moments later, Cassius flopped down beside her and handed Violet a sheet of paper. "New third-year course schedules," said Cass, passing one to Tracy as well. "What's up with you, Roman 6? "Malfoy," said Tracy, twitching her head in the direction of the crowd down the table. Cass looked over in time to see Malfoy pretending to faint with terror again. "Do you want me to shut him up for you?" he asked calmly, raising an eyebrow at Violet. "I bet I could, easily. From what I heard, he about pissed himself when the Dementors were down at his end of the train." "Oh, that's rich," said Tracy. "And here he is, acting like Violet's somehow at fault for getting sick from those horrible things. Even Dumbledore isn't happy to have them around, so I heard. Azkaban must a horrible place." "Well, it's a prison," Violet said, tearing a bread roll in half. "I reckon it should terrible." Beside her, Cassius coughed. "What's on your schedules for today?" he asked loudly, leaning over Violet's shoulder. Surprised at the sudden change of subject, she nonetheless held it up to show him her courses. "I start arithmancy this morning," said Violet. "I've been reading my mother's copy off numerology and grammaticon. She left loads of notes in the pages, so hopefully I'll have a bit of a head start in class." "I've never had Professor Vector," said Cass, "but I've heard she's very strict. Best not let her see all the scribbles in your book, or she might think you've been cheating." "Oh, we don't have anything together until later," Tracy moaned, looking at Violet's schedule as well. She held up her own for comparison. "I've got Muggle studies this morning, then we've got charms, and after lunch we get to start care of magical creatures with Hagrid. Oh, I'm so excited. He looked so happy at the feast, didn't he? I'll bet he's planned something brilliant for our first lesson." "Hang on," said Cassius, squinting at Tracy's schedule. "Why in Merlin's name are you taking Muggle studies? Your half-blood, your whole family are Muggles. You'll know more about them than anyone else in the class." "Well, that's the point, isn't it?" said Tracy, cheeks darkening as she snatched her schedule away from view. "Maybe I wanted to be at the top of a class for a change." "But you're brilliant," Violet blurted. "You do really well in potions, and you got the highest marks in herbology last year, didn't you?" Tracy's blush deepened, but she scrunched up her face as well. "Theodore not beat me by 4 points," she said bitterly. "It was ahead, but after you got petrified. I was so worried all the time and I wasn't sleeping. And Dumbledore cancelled all our exams last year, remember? So our grades were sorted by how well we done in class until then, and well, I wasn't doing as well as I could have been." "Oh," said Violet. A knot of guilt twisted itself into existence in her stomach. She'd missed the last 2 months of the previous school year during her immobile stint in the hospital wing. They hadn't really talked about it, but of course Tracy would have been worried and upset about being gone and all because she'd panicked and gotten careless. "It's not your fault," said Tracy quickly, as though she could read Violet's fears on her face. "No, Romans 6, there wasn't anything you could do. It was my fault." Tracy grabbed hold of Violet's hand and linked their fingers together, grinning broadly. But it's a new year, isn't it? Plenty of time to catch up and prove myself, and that's exactly what I plan to do. When Tracy smiled, it was very difficult not to smile back at her. Violet found herself doing just that, grinning around the bread roll in her mouth and squeezing Tracy's hand beneath the table. Violet realized then just how terribly she'd missed her friends. "You'd better be off, Violet," said Cassius from her other side. Violet turned to him and blinked. "Why?" He nodded at her course schedule. "Arithmancy's on the 7th floor. It'll take you 10 minutes to get there, and I really don't suggest being late, first impressions and all." "Oh." Violet looked at the large hunk of roll still in her hand, shrugged, and shoved the lot of it into her mouth. She gave Cass and Tracy a thumbs up as she slung her bag over her shoulder and headed toward the door. She was stopped, almost at once, by the sight of Hagrid striding into the great hall. He was wearing his long moleskin overcoat and was absent-mindedly swinging a dead polecat from one enormous hand. Violet chewed her bread hurriedly and jogged over to him. "Hagrid," she called, making him turn. "Hagrid, good morning. Mornin' to you as well, Violet," said Hagrid, smiling broadly beneath his great black beard. "Where are you off to in such a hurry? Breakfast's not half over." "Arithmancy," said Violet. "Cassius said it's on the 7th floor, and I shouldn't be late." "Now there's a ruddy complicated subject," Hagrid said, frowning slightly. "Not tha you'll have any trouble with it, mind. I never had a head for numbers and all tha." "Maybe I can teach you," said Violet brightly. "When you're not busy teaching me, I mean. Hagrid, I'm so happy for you." Hagrid's smile returned once more. "Can hardly believe it myself," he said, leaning down to whisper conspiratorially. "Been up since 5 getting everything ready. Me, a teacher. Honesley." "You'll be brilliant," Violet told him firmly. "I'll be in your first class right after lunch. I can't wait to see what you've got planned." Hagrid flushed bright red again and gave Violet several heavy pats on the head that left her slightly dizzy as she staggered from the great hall and started up the grand marble staircase. Hogwarts Castle wasn't truly as massive as it had once seemed to Violet. That did not, however, mean that it was small. With 8 floors, half a dozen towers, and a sprawling network of dungeons and subterranean caverns, not even including the grounds, there was still plenty of castle to get lost in. And lost was exactly how Violet was starting to feel. She'd gotten turned around somewhere along the 5th floor corridor and was sure she'd passed the same suit of armor 3 times, but couldn't seem to find her way back to the main staircase. Panic was just beginning to set in when she took a gamble, made a left turn that she hadn't taken before, and ran headfirst into a familiar face. "Oh," said Hermione, stumbling backward. "Sorry, I didn't see you. What are you doing here?" "Trying to get to class," Violet said, slightly breathless from all the walking. "I can't find the way to arithmancy." Hermione's face lit up at once. "I'm starting arithmancy, too. I asked one of the Ravenclaw prefects for directions, and they actually told me about a shortcut. Come on, we can find it together." With Hermione's help, Violet was finally saved from her own poor sense of direction and led back to the grand staircase. Hermione's shortcut led them off through a very narrow side corridor, up a hidden set of spiral stairs, and out from behind a grand statue of a bearded man wielding a broken plank of wood like an axe. They heard voices ahead and followed them around the corridor to find a small group of students gathered outside of a narrow, closed wooden door. "I think this is it," Hermione muttered as they approached. In the crowd, Violet recognized Blaise Zabini from her own house, as well as a familiar-looking Gryffindor boy that Hermione exchanged a friendly nod with. Violet stuck close to Hermione out of familiarity, and the 2 girls joined their fellows in waiting to enter the classroom. From behind the wooden door, a clock chimed loudly. As soon as the chime faded, there was a sharp click, and the door swung open on its own. "Enter," called a voice from within the shadowy room. With many glances between one another, the students slowly filtered inside. Violet was the last to step inside, and it took a few moments for her eyes to adjust to the low lighting. It was the most well-organized classroom Violet had ever seen. 10 single desks were arranged in 2 precise rows facing the front of the room, the entire wall of which was covered in a polished, spotless blackboard. There wasn't a single chalk mark in sight, nor was there a teacher's desk, as Violet expected. There was a large open gap between the blackboard and the first row of desks that made the room appear larger than it actually was. The back of the room, however, seemed to be a small library in its own right. A half-dozen thin wooden shelves were arranged on either side of a great wooden desk, bare of any clutter and supporting the only source of light in the entire room. A dark shape moved behind the desk, and Professor Vector hoved into view. She was a tall, middle-aged witch whose long brown hair was heavily streaked with grey, and whose eyes were so pale in colour that they appeared almost sightless. As she stood, Violet could just make out a set of dark red robes and a large, heavy-looking black pendant hanging around her neck. "Good morning, students," said Professor Vector, emerging from behind the desk and striding slowly toward the front of the room. "I welcome you to the first arithmancy lesson of the new school year. Before you sit, I must ask, please, that you join me in the front of the room so that we may determine where it is best for you to be placed." Professor Vector had a low, throaty sort of voice, and more than a hint of an accent, though Violet couldn't place it exactly. She and the rest of the class looked around at each other, unsure of what that meant, and all of them jumped in unison as Professor Vector loudly clapped her hands together. "Quickly, please," she said sternly. "We have much to begin learning today, and so little time to learn it. Up front, all of you." In an orderly sort of rush, they all filed into the open space at the front of the classroom, where Professor Vector took a few moments to arrange them into a loose semicircle. Blaze, who was the tallest in the class, was put in the middle, and all the rest of them were fanned out by height on either side of him. Then, starting from the left, Professor Seinstra went down the line and asked everyone to tell her their full names, first, middle, and last. There was a lot of stammering and blushing, and quiet muttering. Hermione Jean Granger was the only one to speak loudly and clearly, and Dean Elliot Thomas was so quiet Violet almost couldn't hear him, even with how close she was standing. "Full name," said Professor Vector, standing in front of Violet as she had done in front of all the others. "Violet Potter." Professor Vector raised a single thick eyebrow. "Full name, please." Violet swallowed. "I don't know it. I think I have a middle name, but I don't, know what it is." Mutters ran down the line. A few titters mixed in between. Violet felt her face go hot. Professor Vector's gaze did not waver, however. "It will be difficult to place you without a full name," she said slowly, her eyes gleaming like twin pale moons. "But we will find a way, Violet Potter." And then she moved on to the girl on Violet's right until she made it all the way down the end of the line. Then Professor Vector circled back around to stand in front of them all, and one by one, assigned them all a number from 0 to 9. Violet was given the number 0, and told to sit in the corresponding desk. Each desk had a silver number stamped on the front, and Violet's was in the first row at the left. Hermione, who was given number 4, was placed all the way at the other end. Professor Vector strode up to the massive blackboard and, gesturing in the air with her wand, wrote the same series of numbers, 0 through 9, in large numbers all across the length of the board. "Numbers," she said in a loud, ringing voice, "are the only words that transcend language. They are not limited by the physical or cultural borders of man. They do not possess any double meanings or hidden connotations. They are purely what they are, and so it is numbers." She finished the number 9 with a flourish and turned sharply to face the group of wide-eyed students in front of her. "That we must look to 4 answers. Each of you should own a copy of Numerology and Grammatica. Produce it now and look to Chapter 1. Before you can begin to divine the power of numbers, you must first understand their meaning. You will read silently until otherwise instructed. Begin." The classroom was filled with the sudden flurry of many people rummaging through their bags at once. all frantic to get to the right page faster than their neighbors to avoid being the last one ready. Violet quietly cracked open her mother's copy of numerology and grammaticon, was immediately calmed by the sight of the foreign yet so familiar handwriting. She'd been practicing it over the summer and had nearly mastered it, though the particular way her mother joined up letters like E and O with her R's was still proving tricky. The first chapter of the book was fairly scarce on notations, which meant that Violet had no choice but to focus on the subject material. The author had a crisp, blunt way of writing that, while very clear to understand, was also incredibly boring. On the fourth page, next to a simple chart of numbers and their corresponding letters, again 1 through 9, Violet noticed with a sinking feeling that there was no 0 listed. Violet found her eyes wandering to one of her mother's first notations in the book. Two sets of lines of numbers were calculated together, though no letters were written above them to help her decipher. 39, 37, 54,151, 38, 11, 2, 1,545,930, 15,175, 47, 11, 2. Beneath the lines of numbers was another small scribble, clearly intended for someone else to read. Look, were both twos. Violet looked hastily between the scrawl and the chart of numbers and letters, trying to spell out the two names listed. The first she gathered, by association, to be her mother's, Lily Evans. But who was the second name? And what did it mean to be a 2? "Is everyone finished with the reading?" said Professor Vector's voice, cutting through the silent room and making Violet jolt in her seat. She looked up and found that while she'd been focused on her book, the blackboard had been cleaned again, leaving it just as spotless as it was when they walked in. "Today's lesson will now come to a close," Professor Seinstra said, looking distantly over their heads. "I have learned much about this new class today, and I expect you all to have learned as much by the time we next meet. Your homework." There were several low groans across the room. Professor Vector closed her mouth and waited for absolute silence again before continuing. "Is to divine the meaning of your own names. You will use the chart you have studied today, and you will return to me with greater knowledge of yourself and those around you. Pack up now and leave quietly." Again came the flurry of rummaging through packs, stuffing books away among quills and rolls of parchment. The scraping of chairs on the wooden floor was like a peal of thunder compared to the last hour of silence, and despite Professor Vector's order for silence, there was plenty of muttering all around. Violet, who was one of the first out of the room, stood by the door and waited for Hermione. Blaise Zabini passed by her, and so did Dean Thomas and the rest of the little collection of students from various houses, but Hermione wasn't amongst them. Violet did a double take, counting the heads of everyone as they walked away, searching for a head of bushy brown hair in the crowd. She tried to peek back inside the classroom, in case Hermione had hung back to ask Professor Vector any questions, but she very narrowly avoided getting hit in the nose by the wooden door as it swung shut and locked with a definite click. In the end, Violet was forced to make the long trek back downstairs by herself. It took her so long to find her way back that, as early as she had left arithmancy, she had to run down the last corridor in order to make it to Charms in time. Violet was panting and red in the face as she burst into Professor Flitwick's classroom. Flitwick was, thankfully, nowhere to be seen, but the class was nearly full up. If not for Tracy waving at her from the second row, Violet might not have been able to find a seat at all. "What happened to you?" Tracy whispered as Violet collapsed into the seat beside her. "Stairs," Violet huffed, digging for her copy of Standard Book of Spells, Year 3. "Lots and lots of stairs. How was arithmancy?" "Oh, weird. Professor Vector's really intense. I'll tell you about it at lunch, yeah." "Oh, my," squeaked a high-pitched voice from the front of the room. Professor Flitwick had appeared and climbed atop the stack of books behind his desk, looking out at all of them with a dramatic, exaggerated look of surprise on his little face. "It appears that someone has left the classroom door open. We can't have that now, can we? If only there was some way for me to close it from where I'm standing without having to move." "Potter did it," called Pansy Parkinson loudly, pointing across the room at where Violet was trying and failing to sink below her desk in shame. Professor Flitwick chuckled. "Thank you, Miss Parkinson, for naming the dastardly culprit. I suppose it should be Miss Potter, then, to close the door for us." Face flushed bright red, Violet muttered an apology and started to rise from her seat. She stopped, however, when Flitwick began to tut. "Oh no, it's not necessary for you to get up, Potter," he said, smiling at her. "Simply close the door from where you are if you would." Violet blinked at him. "Sir," she said uncertainly. "Can't you think of a way?" said Professor Flitwick, his smile widening encouragingly. "Perhaps a way to reach things from a distance and pull them toward you." He raised his hand and swirled it over his head like casting a lasso. Something in Violet's head clicked. "Oh. Oh, right. Violet produced her wand from the pocket of her robes, waved it over her head much the way Flitwick had mimed, and flicked it in the direction of the door. Gasps broke out as a bright, sparkling red rope of magic shot from the tip of Violet's wand all the way across the room. It lashed itself around the doorknob. Violet gave it a solid yank, and the door was pulled and slammed shut with a loud bang. Violet lowered her wand and turned back to Professor Flitwick, smiling apprehensively. He began to clap. "Well done, Potter, well done indeed." 5 points to Slytherin. He stopped clapping abruptly, throwing out both arms to catch his balance as the books beneath him began to totter. After a moment, he straightened back up and made a small show of readjusting his glasses. "Although, perhaps next time you might speak the incantation aloud during a demonstration for the benefit of your fellow students. We don't typically expect non-verbal spells until 6th year, my dear." Violet, who hadn't even realized she didn't speak the spell out loud, went red once more and quickly sat down. She looked across the room and found Pansy's furious eyes on her. Everyone else in the room seemed to be looking at her as well. As being looked at was Violet's least favorite thing in the world, she immediately regretted being given the chance to show off. "Now," started Professor Flitwick, rubbing his hands together eagerly. "As you have all just seen, today we will be starting to learn a very useful little spell that is mostly commonly known as the seize and pull charm. It can be used to close doors, as we have just seen, or to quickly draw objects to you from across a room. One must always be careful, however, not to try and pull something which is too solidly placed to move, lest the thing flying across the room might bear you. As with all of Professor Flitwick's lessons, this one started with a flashy demonstration and then dragged to a crawl as they were made to read up on the spell, its inventor, and its most practical applications. When the charms class had finished, Violet and Tracy practically bounded from the room in excitement. Thanks to last year's lessons from Cassius, the two of them were already well versed in casting cop retractum and had a definite edge over their classmates. The girls entered the great hall beaming and laughing, but the first thing Violet saw across the room was Ron's stricken face and the hunched, tense shoulders of her brother at the Gryffindor table. "I'll catch up," she muttered to Tracy and set off across the room. "Don't know what you're talking about," Ron was saying angrily as Violet approached. "Grims scare the living daylights out of most wizards." "There you are, then," retorted Hermione, her tone superior. "They see the grim and die of fright. The grim's not an omen, it's the cause of death. And Harry's still with us because he's not stupid enough to see one and think, right, well, I'd better kick the bucket then." "What's going on?" Violet asked in alarm, nudging Ron aside so that she could sit next to her brother. Harry started to speak, but Hermione huffed dramatically and talked over him. "Harry got his fortune told by some soggy leaves in divination today," said Hermione loudly, "and now everyone, including Ronald, thinks he's going to die. Even Professor McGonagall said it was rubbish, Harry. You can't really believe." "I don't believe anything, all right," Harry said, clearly trying to disappear into the collar of his robes. "Romans 6, it's nothing to worry about. Professor Trelawney says she saw a dog in my tea leaves that's supposed to be some sort of omen of death." "But where did see a dog?" said Violet, her stomach clenching suddenly. "The great black thing when we were leaving the Dursleys, see," said Ron. He was pointing at Violet with his fork, but his wild eyes were fixed on Hermione. Violet says she saw it too. It had to be a grim. Probably a stray, said Hermione calmly. Ron threw his hands in the air in exasperation. So what's the grim then? Violet asked Harry. Is that the name of the dog? Harry shrugged unhelpfully. I suppose that's what Professor Trelawney kept calling it. But did she say anything else? Violet pressed. Across the table, Hermione snorted. Only that it meant Harry was going to die horribly, of course, she said. Honestly, if you two really did see a dog, you saw it weeks ago. If seeing it kills you, shouldn't you have already dropped dead by now? You're just put off because Trelawney said you don't have the right aura, said Ron Hartley. You just don't like being bad at something for a change. He had clearly touched a nerve. Hermione slammed her book down on the table so hard that bits of meat and carrot flew everywhere. If being good at divination means I have to pretend to see death omens in a lump of tea leaves, I'm not sure I'll be studying it for much longer. That lesson was absolute rubbish compared with my arithmancy class. She snatched up her back and stalked away. Violet frowned after her. Honestly, I thought arithmancy was a bit rubbish, too, she said, rising from the table as well. Violet ruffled Harry's hair for good measure and wandered back over to the Slytherin table to eat. Violet was pleased to get out of the castle after lunch. Yesterday's rain had cleared. The sky was a clear, pale grey, and the grass was springy and damp underfoot as they set off for their first ever Care of Magical Creatures class. Cassius had really gotten Tracy hyped up for the subject, promising loads of funny little creatures and interesting lessons ahead. She was practically bouncing along beside Violet as they went down the sloping lawns to Hagrid's hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Last year Violet would have been chomping at the bit to get up close and personal with a magical monster or two, except that now she had been up close and personal with one of the most terrifying monsters of all, a basilisk, and the experience had left her feeling far more nervous than excited. Hagrid was waiting for his class at the door of his hut. He stood in his moleskin overcoat, with Fang the boarhound at his heels, and looked impatient to start. He did, however, wave back at something over Violet's head. She turned and was surprised to see the whole class of Gryffindors heading down to join them. Harry walked awkwardly between Ron and Hermione, who were evidently not speaking to one another. "Come on, now, get a move on," Hagrid called as the two houses approached. "Got a real treat for ye today. Great lesson coming up, everyone here. Right, follow me." For one nasty moment, Violet thought Hagrid was going to lead them into the forest. The last time Violet had set foot inside, she'd been traumatized by the sight of a dead unicorn and attacked by the thing that killed it, which turned out to be Lord Voldemort himself. She was not at all keen to go back. However, Hagrid strolled off around the edge of the trees, and 5 minutes later they found themselves outside a kind of paddock. There was nothing in there. "Everyone gather round the fence here," he called. "Thars it make sure ye can see now. First thing ye'll want to do is open your books." "How?" said the cold, drawling voice of Draco Malfoy. "Eh," said Hagrid. "How do we open the books?" Malfoy repeated. He took out his copy off the Monster Book of Monsters, which he had bound shut with a length of rope. Other people took theirs out too. Some, like Harry, had belted their books shut. Others had crammed them inside tight bags or clamped them together with binder clips. Hasn't anyone been able to open their books?" said Hagrid, looking crestfallen. The class all shook their heads. "Ye've got to stroke 'em," said Hagrid, as though this was the most obvious thing in the world. "Look," he took Violet's copy and ripped off the brown wrapping paper that still clung to it. The book tried to bite, but Hagrid ran a giant forefinger down its spine, and the book shivered and then fell open and lay quiet in his hand. "Oh, how silly we've all been," Malfoy sneered. "We should have stroked them. Why didn't we guess?" I thought they were funny," Hagrid said uncertainly to Violet. "Oh, tremendously funny," cried Malfoy. "Really witty, giving us books." That Malfoy caught sight of the warning look on Violet's face and shut up. He glared fiercely back at her, but she was pleased that he'd quieted down on his own. Violet wanted Hagrid's first lesson to be a success, and she didn't fancy earning herself a detention to do it. "Rig, then," said Hagrid, who seemed to have lost his thread. So ye've got your books, and now ye need the magical creatures." "Yeah, so I'll go and get 'em. Hang on." He strode away from them into the forest and out of sight. "God, this place is going to the dogs," said Malfoy loudly. "That oaf teaching classes. My father'll have a fit when I tell him your father's not a school governor any more," Violet said, even more loudly. "You can whine to him all you like, Malfoy, but I don't see what good it can do you." A chorus of oohs broke out among both houses. Malfoy's cheeks went pink, but his face was twisted with fury. "Better be careful, Potter, speaking to me like that. I might just have to put a word in with the Dementors about where you sleep." "Ooh," squealed a dark-skinned Gryffindor girl, pointing toward the opposite side of the paddock. Just in time as well, as Harry and Tracy had both taken 2 steps toward Malfoy. Trotting toward them were a dozen of the most fascinating creatures Violet had ever seen. They had the bodies, hind legs, and tails of horses, but the front legs, wings, and heads of what seemed to be giant eagles, with cruel, steel-colored beaks and large, brilliantly orange eyes. The talons on their front legs were 1/2 a foot long and deadly-looking. Each of the beasts had a thick leather collar around its neck, which was attached to a long chain, and the ends of all of these were held in the vast hands of Hagrid, who came jogging into the paddock behind the creatures. "Gee up there," he roared, shaking the chains and urging the creatures toward the fence where the class stood. Everyone drew back slightly as Hagrid reached them and tethered the creatures to the fence. "Hippogriffs," Hagrid roared happily, waving a hand at them. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Violet could see exactly what Hagrid meant. Even the shock she felt at first seeing them couldn't outshine the hippogriffs' gleaming coats, changing smoothly from feather to hair, each of them a different color. Stormy gray, bronze, pinkish roan, gleaming chestnut, and inky black. "So," said Hagrid, rubbing his hands together and beaming around, "if ye wan, come a bit nearer." Violet and Tracy stepped forward at once. After a moment, Harry, Ron, and Hermione approached more cautiously. "Now, first thing ye gotta know about hippogriffs is they're proud," said Hagrid. "Easily offended, hippogriffs are. Don't never insult one, 'cause it might be the last thing ye do." Violet could hear muttering behind her and had a sick, sneaking suspicion that it was Malfoy, plotting with Crabbe and Goyle about how best to disrupt the lesson. "Yer always wait fer the hippogriff to make the furs move," Hagrid continued. "It's polite, see? Ye walk toward him, and ye bow, and ye wait. If he bows back, ye're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow back, then get away from him sharpish, 'cause those talon hurt." "Right, who wants to go first?" Most of the class backed farther away in answer. Even Violet and Tracy, who very much wanted to go first, had misgivings. The hippogriffs were tossing their fierce heads and flexing their powerful wings. They didn't see to like being tethered like this. "No one," said Hagrid with a pleading look. Violet heard Tracy take a deep breath, clearly ready to take one for the team, and quickly grabbed hold of her hand. But it wasn't Tracy she should have worried about. "I'll do it," said Harry. There was an intake of breath from behind him, and 2 Gryffindor girls whispered, "Ooh, no, Harry, remember your tea leaves." Harry ignored them, and ignored Violet's blatant attempts at eye contact with him. He climbed over the paddock fence. "Good man, Harry," roared Hagrid. "Right then, let's see how ye get on with Buckbeak." He untied one of the chains, pulled the grey hippogriff away from its fellows, and slipped off its leather collar. Violet, along with the rest of the class on the other side of the paddock, was holding her breath. "Easy now, Harry," said Hagrid quietly. "Ye've got eye contact, now try not to blink. Hippogriffs darn, trust ye if ye blink too much." Harry remained frozen in place, staring up at Buckbeak. Violet held tight to Tracy's hand as Buckbeak turned his great, sharp head and stared at Harry with one fierce orange eye. "Thar's it," said Hagrid. "Thar's it, Harry. Now bow." Harry did as he was told, though his form left something to be desired. He gave a short bow and then looked back up. The hippogriff continued to stare haughtily at him. It didn't move. "Ah," said Hagrid, sounding worried. "Right back away now, Harry. Easy does it." But then, to Violet's enormous surprise, Buckbeak suddenly bent its scaly front knees and sank into what was an unmistakable bow. "Well done, Harry," said Hagrid, ecstatic. "Right ye can touch him. Pat his beak, go on." Harry moved slowly toward the hippogriff and reached out toward it. He patted the beak several times, and the hippogriff closed its eyes lazily, as though enjoying it. The class broke into applause. Violet felt as though she might faint. "Rig, then, Harry," said Hagrid. "I reckon he mig, let ye ride him." "What?" said Harry, stepping back in panic, but far too late. Hagrid strode toward him and stuck two massive hands beneath Harry's armpits, lifting him as easily as Violet lifted Crookshanks. Harry's legs dangled uselessly as Hagrid hefted him onto the hippogriff's back. "Mind ye darn pull any of his feathers out," said Hagrid. "He won like that." Buckbeak stood up. Everywhere Violet could see was feathers, and Harry didn't look as though he had the first idea of where to hold on, but there was no time for that. "Go on, then," roared Hagrid, slapping the hippogriff's hindquarters. Without warning, 12-foot wings flapped open on either side of Harry. Violet screamed as the bird flapped and kicked off, soaring upward with her brother barely clinging to its back. She could hear laughter behind her and knew it was Malfoy. Whether he was making fun of her fear or Harry's panic, she didn't know and did not care. The only thing that mattered was Harry not falling to his death. She watched intently as Buckbeak flew Harry once around the paddock and then headed back to the ground. The landing, which was graceful for the hippogriff, looked very bumpy and uncomfortable for Harry, who slid to the ground as soon as he was able. "Good work, Harry," roared Hagrid as everyone, except Malfoy and his crowd, cheered. "Okay, who else wants a go?" Emboldened by Harry's success, Violet and Tracy led the charge as the rest of the class climbed cautiously into the paddock. Hagrid untied the hippogriffs one by one, and soon people were bowing nervously all over the paddock. Neville ran repeatedly backward from his, which didn't seem to want to bed its knees. Violet and Tracy took turns bowing to the bronze, who seemed slightly more agreeable than the grey that Harry had ridden. That hippogriff, Buckbeak, had unfortunately gone to Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle. It had bowed to Malfoy, who was now patting his beak, looking disdainful. "This is very easy," Malfoy drawled, loud enough to Harry and likely Hagrid to hear him. "I knew it must have been, if Potter could do it. I bet you're not dangerous at all, are you?" he said to the hippogriff. "Are you, you great ugly brute?" It happened in a flash. Buckbeak reared back and swiped at Malfoy with his steely talons, and suddenly Malfoy was on the ground screaming in pain. Buckbeak reared back once more, ready to make a second strike with his sharp, vicious beak. Violet's arm flew out in a panic, and Buckbeak let out a screech of outrage as his beak collided with nothing but a solid foot from where Malfoy lay, screaming. An instant later and Hagrid was there, wresting the hippogriff back into his collar as he strained to get at Malfoy, who lay in the grass, blood blossoming over his robes. "I'm dying," Malfoy yelled as the class panicked. "I'm dying, look at me." "It's killed me." "You're not dying," said Hagrid, who had gone very white. "Someone help me, gotta get him out of here." Hermione ran to hold open the gate as Hagrid lifted Malfoy easily. As they passed, Violet saw there was a long, deep gash on Malfoy's arm. Blood splattered the grass and Hagrid ran with him up the slope toward the castle. Very shaken, the Care of Magical Creatures class followed at a walk. Malfoy's posse were all shouting about Hagrid. "They should fire him straight away," said Pansy Parkinson, who was in tears. "It was Malfoy's fault," snapped Dean Thomas. Crabbe and Goyle flexed their muscles threateningly, but Dean didn't look even mildly cowed by them. They all climbed the stone steps into the deserted entrance hall. "I'm going to see if he's okay," said Pansy, and they all watched her up the marble staircase. The Gryffindors, still muttering about Malfoy, headed up as well in the direction of their tower common room. Violet, Tracy, and the rest of the Slytherins proceeded downstairs to the dungeons. "He's such an idiot," Tracy said, taking the steps 2 by 2 and forcing Violet to keep up with her. Heck knew not to insult the hippogriffs, and he did it anyway just to mess things up for Hagrid's first class. You should have let the bloody bird have at him, Romans 6. Me, said Violet. What did I have to do with it? I was standing right there. I saw you put up a barrier, or whatever it was you did. Buckbeak couldn't get to Malfoy anyways. Shame. I didn't mean to do anything, Violet muttered as they entered the common room. I know, Violet, you never do. Violet didn't know quite how to respond to that, so she didn't. With no classes for the rest of the day and nothing to do until dinner time, Violet holed herself up in the girls' dormitory and decided to get a head start on her homework. Her arithmancy homework was quite simple. All Violet had to do was figure out which numbers corresponded to the letters of her name, add them all together, then reduce them down to a single digit. After a bit of confusion and triple-checking her math, Violet came up with the number 6. According to numerology and grammatica, that meant she was friendly, loyal, and reliable, quick to adapt, unsuccessful in business, and prone to complacency. There were other numbers that she could reduce her name down to, but of course she needed her middle name to do it properly. With no idea how to find out what her middle name was, or indeed if she even had one, there was no way she could write home to Aunt Petunia and ask for it. Violet could do nothing more but hope that Professor Vector wouldn't take points away from her for not being able to do it completely. While wistfully looking over the number charts again, Violet found her eyes drawn back to the margins of the book where her mother had once calculated the numbers of her own name, and someone else's, excited to show them that they were the same. It was much harder to translate numbers into letters than it was the other way around. There were multiple letters that could correspond to the same number, and whoever this person was, their name was 12 letters long. While it made for an intriguing puzzle, figuring out the name of her mother's childhood friend wasn't exactly the most pressing thing on Violet's mind. Something had been bothering her ever since that afternoon, though with everything going on, she'd had little time to dwell on it. What Harry, Ron, and Hermione had said about their first divination class had jogged Violet's memory back to not only the great black dog on Magnolia Crescent, but the same black dog that had stared back at them from the table in Flourish and Blots. Violet hadn't touched her copy of Death Omens. What to do when you know the worst is coming, since packing it up at the leaky cauldron, pulling it out now. She was struck by just how frightening the image on the cover was. The dark mass of a hulking, spectral black dog with 2 glowing pinpricks of white light in place of eyes, staring back out at her from the misty cover. Though most magical pictures in the magical world were able to move around freely in their frames, the dog didn't appear to shift at all as Violet looked at it. Giving up, she flipped through to the table of contents until she found what she was looking for. The book was split into sections by the apparent severity certain omens, ranging from minor to inevitable. Violet was not encouraged to find Grim, the categorized under grave. The Grim is an iconic omen of death, reputed to bring about the demise of the person who encounters it. Taking the shape of a large, black, spectral dog, the Grim is perhaps the most well-known of omens and has earned infamy throughout the wizarding world. It is considered among seers as one of the worst, if not the worst, omen that one can encounter, for it is well documented that the person who bears witness to the Grim will soon surely face their demise. A shiver ran down Violet's spine. That certainly wasn't very encouraging and matched with what Ron had been yelling about at lunchtime. But could it really be true? Hermione didn't seem to believe it, and she'd said that Professor McGonagall didn't put much stock into omens or divination either. Normally Violet would respect McGonagall's judgment on any subject, but she had seen the same thing as Harry that night. The looming, shadowy hound that had been watching them from the darkness. Why hadn't it killed them right then and there? Why drag things out like this? As Hermione pointed out, why should they be alive weeks later if the mere sight of the Grim caused witches and wizards to face their death? Violet shut the book and stuffed it back into the bottom of her trunk. She didn't want to think about death and dying anymore. Things had been trying to kill her and Harry since they were babies, and nothing had managed to do the job yet. Voldemort had failed 3 times already. Harry had escaped from man-eating spiders, and the pair of them had both faced an ancient basilisk and lived. If, after all of that, plus all the years of suffering under the Dursleys' roof, if the sight a big, spooky-looking dog was all it took to do Violet Potter in, she would eat her own wand in shock. Rubbish, Violet thought, pulling Crookshanks from the foot of the bed and holding him to her chest. "No dog is going to get me," she muttered out loud, burying her face in the thick, soft fur of Crookshanks' neck. "You won't let it, will you, Crooks? I know cats are meant to be afraid of dogs, but you're too fierce for that, aren't you?" "Aren't you, love?" Crookshanks, who had moments ago been sleeping soundly, let out a grumpy little mew. Violet kissed the top of his little head, put him back where he'd been laying, and climbed out of bed to head up to dinner. Chapter 7. The Boggart in the Wardrobe. Malfoy didn't reappear in classes until late on Thursday morning, when the Slytherins and Gryffindors were halfway through double potions. He swaggered into the dungeon, his right arm covered in bandages and bound up in a sling, acting, in Violet's opinion, as though he were the heroic survivor of some dreadful battle. "How is it, Draco?" simpered Pansy Parkinson. "Does it hurt terribly?" "Yeah," said Malfoy, putting on a brave sort of grimace, but Violet saw him wink at Crabbe and Goyle when Pansy had looked away. Next to Violet, Tracy quietly mimed retching onto the floor. Settle down," said Professor Snape idly. He was focusing on the simmering cauldron in front of him, and had unfortunately missed Malfoy and Pansy's sickening exchange. Even so, the admonishment was unusually light. Normally, if a student walked into class late and started making a fool of themselves, Professor Snape would give them detention, as well as a humiliating dressing down. But Malfoy had always been able to get away with anything in Snape's class. They were making a new potion today, a shrinking solution. Violet watched with narrowed eyes as Malfoy set up his cauldron right next to Harry and Ron, so that they were preparing their ingredients on the same table. "Sir," Malfoy called, "sir, I'll need help cutting up these daisy roots because of my arm." "Weasley, cut up Malfoy's roots for him," said Snape without looking up. Ron went brick red. "There's nothing wrong with your arm," he hissed at Malfoy. Violet, glancing over from the next table, saw Malfoy smirk. "Weasley, you heard Professor Snape. Cut up these roots." Ron seized his knife, pulled Malfoy's roots toward him, and began to chop them roughly so that they were all different sizes. "Professor," drawled Malfoy, "Weasley's mutilating my roots. Sit." Snape finally looked up from his work at the front of the class and approached the table. With his back to Violet, she couldn't see his face, but judging from Ron's sour expression, he clearly wasn't smiling. "Change roots with Malfoy, Weasley." "But, sir—" "Now," said Professor Snape in his most dangerous voice. The tone made Violet flinch. It reminded her of the encounter she and Harry had witnessed in their first year, secretly observing Snape threatening Professor Quirrell in the Forbidden Forest. Though it was later revealed that Professor Snape was trying to scare Quirrell straight, instead of intimidating him into doing his bidding, the scene had left a vivid, uncomfortable impression in Violet's mind. "And, sir," said Malfoy, his voice full of malicious laughter, "I'll need this shrivelfig skinned." "Potter," Violet's head snapped up, only to realize he was talking to Harry. "You can skin Malfoy's shrivelfig," said Snape coldly. He turned and started making his rounds through the class, giving Violet back a clear view of Harry's table. Her brother looked furious, and Ron's face was redder than she'd ever seen it. Malfoy was smirking. "Seen your pal Hagrid lately?" she heard him say quietly, and immediately stiffened. "None of your business," said Ron jerkily. "I'm afraid he won't be a teacher much longer," said Malfoy in a tone of mock sorrow. "Father's not very happy about my injury." "What injury?" Violet heard Tracy breathe beside her. "He's complained to the school governors, and to the Ministry of Magic. Father's got a lot of influence, you know. You mean a lot of money. And with a lasting injury like this," he gave a huge, fake sigh, "who knows if my arm will ever be the same again." "Ow!" Violet hissed loudly. Her hands had been shaking in anger, and she'd sliced deeply into the side of her thumb. She dropped the knife as blood welled up from the cut. Professor Snape swept over to her in an instant. "Hospital wing, Potter," he said, looking down at her bleeding thumb. Violet shook her head. "That's all right, sir. It's not too bad. I can still do my own work, unlike some people." Across the way, Malfoy's ears went pink. Violet could have sworn the corner of Snape's mouth twitched up in a smirk. "Very well," said Professor Snape. "Beware getting blood onto your workstation, or I'll have you staying behind the scrub the whole desk clean. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Violet said brightly. She sucked the cut until it stopped bleeding, shot a wilting look at Malfoy, and went back to slicing her caterpillars. A few cauldrons away, Neville was in trouble. Neville regularly went to pieces in potions lessons. It was his worst subject, and his great fear of Professor Snape made things 10 times worse. His potion, which was supposed to be a bright acid green, had turned orange Longbottom, said Snape, ladling some up and allowing it to splash back into the cauldron so that everyone could see. "Orange. Tell me, boy, does anything penetrate that thick skull of yours? Didn't you hear me say, quite clearly, that only one rat's spleen was needed? Didn't I state plainly that a dash of leech juice would suffice? What do I have to do to make you understand, Longbottom?" Neville was pink and trembling. He looked as though he was on the verge of tears. "Please, sir," said Hermione, "please, I could help Neville put it right." "I don't remember asking you to show off, Miss Granger," said Snape coldly. "Longbottom, at the end of this lesson, we will feed a few drops of this potion to your toad and see what happens. Perhaps it will encourage you to do it properly." Professor Snape moved away, leaving Neville trembling with fear. Violet looked over at him sympathetically, but he was too far away for her to help him without getting caught. Nor did she think Neville would be particularly inclined to accept help from her anyways, after the nasty misunderstanding between them the year before. Rather than snitch on a classmate, Violet had taken the blame for tampering with one of Neville's potions, a mistake that sent her to the hospital wing. The truth had come out, but Violet never would forget the look of hurt and betrayal on Neville's round face when she had first been made to apologize to him. Fortunately, Hermione was close to him and known to be trustworthy. Violet could see her leaning closer to Neville's table, whispering to him out of the side of her mouth. "Hey, Harry," someone muttered. A Gryffindor boy at the table behind Harry, leaning over to borrow his brass scales. "Have you heard? Daily Prophet this morning they reckon Sirius Black's been sighted." "Where?" said Harry and Ron quickly. Violet stopped chopping so that she could listen in as well. "Not too far from here," said the boy, sounding excited. "It was a muggle who saw him. Course, she didn't really understand. The muggles think he's just an ordinary criminal, don't they? So she phoned the telephone line. By the time the Ministry of Magic got there, he was gone. Not too far from here." Ron repeated, looking significantly at Harry, then quickly away when he caught Violet's eye as well. Malfoy was looking at the pair of them as well. "What, Malfoy? Need something else skinned?" Violet added her caterpillars and stirred slowly, looking out the corner of her eye at Malfoy, who had leaned malevolently across the table toward Harry. "Thinking of trying to catch Black single-handed, Potter?" "Yeah, that's right," said Harry offhandedly. Malfoy's thin mouth was curving into a mean smile. "Of course, if it was me," he said quietly, "I'd have done something before now. I wouldn't be staying in school like a good boy. I'd be out there looking for him." "What are you talking about, Malfoy?" said Ron roughly. Malfoy said something, too softly for Violet to hear from where she sat, and then laughed. He leaned back a bit, sneering. Harry was looking confused. "Maybe you'd rather not risk your neck," said Malfoy. "Want to leave it to the Dementors, do you? But if it was me, I'd want revenge. I'd hunt him down myself." "What are you talking about?" said Harry angrily, but at that moment Professor Snape called. "You should have finished adding your ingredients by now. This potion needs to stew before it can be drunk, so clear away while it simmers, and then we'll test Longbottoms." Crabbe and Goyle laughed openly, watching Neville sweat as he stirred his potion feverishly. Violet and Tracy packed away their unused ingredients and went to wash their hands and ladles in the stone basin in the corner. What was Malfoy talking about? Violet muttered, sidling up to Harry as she stuck her hands under the icy jet that poured from the gargoyle's mouth. Why would we want revenge on Black? He hasn't done anything to us yet. He's making it up, said Ron savagely. He's trying to make Harry do something stupid. He doesn't have to try so hard to dart that, Violet muttered, catching her brother's eye with a smile. Harry shook his head. Thanks for that, Violet. At the end of the lesson in sight, Professor Snape strode over to Neville, who was cowering by his cauldron. Everyone gather round, said Snape, his black eyes glittering, and watch what happens to Longbottom's toad. If he has managed to produce a shrinking solution, it will shrink to a tadpole. If, as I don't doubt, he has done it wrong, his toad is likely to be poisoned. Violet frowned unhappily as Snape picked up Trevor the toad in his left hand and dipped a small spoon into Neville's potion, which was now green. He trickled a few drops down Trevor's throat. There was a moment of hushed silence, in which Trevor gulped. Then there was a small pop, and Trevor the tadpole was wriggling in Snape's palm. The whole lot of Gryffindors burst into applause, with Violet, Tracy, and a couple other Slytherins joining in. Only Malfoy and his crew stayed silent. Snape, looking sour, pulled a small bottle from the pocket of his robe, poured a few drops on top of Trevor, and he reappeared suddenly, fully grown. 5 points from Gryffindor, said Snape, which wiped the smiles from every face. I told you not to help him, Miss Granger. Class dismissed. Neville took Trevor with shaking hands and darted from the classroom with him. Violet slung her bag over her shoulder, ready to follow her brother out and continue their conversation when Professor Snape called, "Hold a moment, Potter." Violet and Harry both stopped and turned in the doorway. "Sir," they said together, staring expectantly. Professor Snape glared at the pair of them. "Miss Potter," he snapped. "The rest of you out." After a nervous look back at Violet, Harry left the potions classroom and shut the door quietly behind him. Violet swallowed and made her way back to Snape's desk at the front of the class. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. "Not today, Potter," said Snape, who was magically clearing away the ingredients from his desk. "Though I believe you have several hours until dinner, so there's still time." Violet, surprised by the jab, giggled. Snape looked up at her. He stared for an uncomfortably long moment at her face. "Who struck you?" he asked softly, and it took a moment for Violet to realize what he was talking about. Her hand jumped up to her cheek, and the bruise that still lingered there. It was fading, just very slowly. "No one," she lied, covering the bruise with her fingers. "I fell." "You think I don't know a handprint when I see one?" said Professor Snape. His voice was still soft, but his black eyes were glinting oddly. "Who struck you?" Violet weighed her options. She could stick with the lie easily, and likely get Snape to lecture her about clumsiness, but it would protect her and Harry from revealing the tragic and embarrassing state of their home life. Or she could name Uncle Vernon as the culprit, and what? What could Professor Snape do about it? The Minister of Magic already knew what was going on, and he said he would do something, didn't he? "My uncle," blurted Violet, throwing caution to the wind. She'd had enough of lying, enough of covering up for the Dursleys' cruelties. "He slapped me." Snape didn't look shocked or sympathetic or try to console her. He continued to stare, his thin lips going slightly thinner. "Why? He doesn't like magic," Violet said plainly. "Has he hit you before?" asked Snape. Violet hesitated a moment. "Not in the face, sir, no." "And Petunia allows this?" he asked, an edge to his voice. The laugh that bubbled out of Violet's mouth wasn't mirthful in the least. It sounded bitter and strained even to her own ears. "It doesn't matter what she knows, as if she's not just as bad at him. Aunt Petunia hates magic probably more than Uncle Vernon does. She won't have it in the house. She'll barely have me and Harry in the house," and Violet broke off suddenly. There was a funny sort of ringing in her ears as she looked back into the black eyes across from her, watching her so intently. She tilted her head to the side and asked, "How do you know my aunt's name?" Professor Snape was usually quite expressive with his emotions, be it anger, displeasure, or delight. But in that moment, his features were completely unreadable to Violet. I'm familiar with the names of the guardians of most, if not all, the students in my house, Miss Potter, Snape said. And if you'll recall, I've had several occasions to write to your aunt and uncle regarding your behavior over the years. Violet flushed slightly, but the ringing was still in her ears, like a distant, high-pitched chime being struck. But you didn't call her my aunt, she pressed, not really sure why she was doing it. You called her Petunia, like you knew her. My apologies for any overt familiarity, said Professor Snape. But no, I don't believe I've been acquainted with Mrs. Dursley. Now Snape stood up abruptly, and Violet took a hasty step back, startled, but he turned and walked away from her, going instead for the locked door to his personal storage closet. He disappeared inside, and Violet, unsure what else to do, stood there and fidgeted. When Professor Snape appeared a minute later, he carried a small, stoppered pot in his hand, which he reached across the desk and set in front of Violet. Apply a thin layer of this to the bruise before bed, he told her. It will have faded by morning. Oh, said Violet, taken aback by both the gesture and the change of subject. Thank you, sir. You can bring the jar when you return tomorrow evening, Snape said without looking at her. He had gone back to clearing away his desk, sending bottles and jars of ingredients sailing smoothly back to the places on the shelves lining the walls. Why would I come back here tomorrow evening? Violet asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. I don't have your class again until next week, sir. Pleased that I am you've memorized your entire schedule so quickly, said Professor Snape dryly. Yowl returning to my classroom tomorrow evening, and every Friday evening hereafter to continue serving out your detentions which, due to the unfortunate events of last year, were left incomplete. My detentions, Violet said, stunned. She was outraged to the verge of tears for several moments, wondering what One-Arth could have done to earn so many detentions that they could carry over from the school year before. But then, you mean you're still going to be giving me lessons? Again, Professor Snape looked up at her, glancing sidelong from beneath the curtains of his greasy hair. Though that may be what such meetings are, I would not appreciate word spreading that I'm offering private tutoring indiscriminately. If any dunderheads show up at my door demanding I give up my precious few after hours for their benefit, it will be you, Miss Potter, that I look to blame. Is that clear? Yes, sir, very clear, sir, Violet said, beaming. The prospect of getting back into learning advanced potions and brewing techniques had wiped all worries and suspicion from her mind. She'd learned so much from Professor Snape last year and was ecstatic at the opportunity to continue doing so. Thank you, Professor. Don't thank me yet, Potter, Snape said, looking away from her once more. He glanced at the ancient clock that hung at the back of the room, then reached for a sheet of parchment. You've missed the break. You'll be late. What is your next class? Oh, Professor Lupin's. Defense against the dark arts, I mean. Snape's quill paused over the parchment. It hung there long enough for a fat, black bead of ink to drip onto it, seeping into the paper. Violet couldn't see his face for the hair in the way, but it was obvious from his rigid posture that he wasn't happy at all. From outside the classroom, Violet could hear the footsteps and voices of the next class waiting to be let in. Finally, Professor Snape scrawled a quick note on the page, passed his hand over the paper to dry the ink, folded it, and pressed the tip of his wand to the seam, leaving an official-looking green seal where it touched. He thrust the paper at Violet. He did not, however, let go when she tried to take it. Violet looked up and found herself staring into his cold, black eyes. Be wary of that man, Snape said quietly, his gaze boring into her. He is not what he seems. He let go of the paper. Violet blinked and suddenly found herself staring at his back, confusion and icy dread mingling in the pit of her stomach. She wanted to ask what that meant, what heck knew, but the voices outside the door were growing louder and more impatient, and Professor Snape was unlikely to answer any more questions from her today. She'd taken up enough of his time. Violet pocketed the letter and the small jar Professor Snape had given her and hurried out of the dungeons, with a terrible uncertainty churning in her guts. Violet raced from the dungeons to the third floor as fast as her legs would carry her. She leapt over the trick step on the grand staircase, skidded around every corner she rounded, and right as a stitch began to form in her side, made it to the third floor corridor with Professor Snape's note of pardon clutched in her left hand. The door to the defense against the dark arts classroom was shut. Violet seized the handle, yanked it open, and ran directly into Professor Lupin, who was doing the exact same thing from the other side. They collided painfully. "Oof!" grunted Lupin, staggering back. Violet clutched her nose, which had hit his chest rather forcefully, blinking hard against the sudden pain. From inside the classroom, she heard the laughter of a dozen other students break out. "Sorry," Violet gasped as she steadied herself on the doorframe. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't expect anyone to be." "It's quite all right, Violet," said Professor Lupin kindly, smiling, though he did look a little startled. He was as shabby as ever, but looked healthier than he had on the train, as though he had had a few square meals. "Glad to see you made it to class. We were just heading out. I'd hate for you to have missed us." Violet realized that all of her classmates were gathered in a disorderly line behind Lupin, giggling and staring her. They did indeed to be leaving the room. I have a note," said Violet sheepishly. She stuck Snape's note out in front of her. Professor Lupin took it and tucked it into his pocket without so much as a glance. "Excellent, thank you. Would you care to join the rest of the class, please? We'll be having a practical lesson today." Bewildered, Violet quickly stepped aside to let Professor Lupin lead the group of her classmates out of the room. It was another double lesson with the Gryffindors, meaning that Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Tracy hung back toward the end of the line to join up with Violet. "Are you okay?" Tracy asked, rushing up to Violet and immediately linking their arms together. "I'm surprised you didn't bowl him right over with how hard you two ran into each other." "Oh, shut up," Violet muttered, flushing again. Tracy giggled again. Harry appeared on Violet's other side. "What did Snape want?" he asked quietly. "Did he try to get you in trouble for something?" Violet knew all too well that Harry had a grudge against Professor Snape, and after his treatment of Neville in their last lesson, she couldn't really fault him for it. Not Thathy had to know that, of course. "I lost 50 house points for mouthing off," Violet said flatly, "and I got about 11 detentions with Filch for it, too." Harry looked horrified. Violet cracked a grin and punched him gently in the arm. "I'm kidding, Harry, don't be daft." "That's not funny, Roman 6. I was really angry for a second there," Harry said, a flush creeping up the back of his neck. "So what did he really want then?" "I mean, Snape kept you long enough after class." "It's nothing, he just wanted to talk to me." "But what about?" "I'm not in trouble, don't worry about it." "Violet, it's Snape, of course I'm worried about it." "Oh no," groaned Ron. The twins both looked from their bickering and realized that the class had come to a halt again. Up ahead, floating upside down in midair and stuffing the nearest keyhole with chewing gum, was Peeves the poltergeist. Peeves didn't look up until Professor Lupin was 2 feet away. Then he wiggled his curly-toed feet and broke into song. "Loony, loopy Lupin," Peeves sang. "Loony, loopy Lupin, loony, loopy Lupin." Rude and unmanageable as he almost always was, Peeves usually showed some respect toward the teachers. Everyone looked quickly at Professor Lupin to see how he would take this. To their surprise, he was still smiling. "I'd take that gum out of the keyhole if I were you, Peeves," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Filch won't be able to get into his brooms." Filch was the Hogwarts caretaker, a bad-tempered, failed wizard who waged a constant war against the students, and indeed Peeves. However, Peeves paid no attention to Professor Lupin's words, except to blow a loud, wet raspberry. Professor Lupin gave a small sigh and took out his wand. "This is a useful little spell," he told the class over his shoulder. "Please watch closely." He raised the wand to shoulder height, said, "Wadiwasi," and pointed it at Peeves. With the force of a bullet, the wad of chewing gum shot out of the keyhole and straight down Peeves' left nostril. He whirled upright and zoomed away, cursing. "Cool, sir," said Dean Thomas in amazement. "Thank you, Dean," said Professor Lupin, putting his wand away again. Shall we proceed? They all set off again, most of the class looking at shabby Professor Lupin with increased respect. The exceptions, of course, were Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle. Violet could see them muttering to one another up ahead and hated to think what horrible things they might be saying. Nevertheless, they followed with the rest, as Professor Lupin led them down a second corridor and stopped right outside the staff room door. "Inside, please," said Professor Lupin, opening it and standing back. The staff room, a long, paneled room full of old, mismatched chairs, was empty except for one teacher. Professor Flitwick was sitting in a low armchair with a cup of steaming tea resting on the arm, and he squeaked in surprise at the sight of them all as they filed in. Good gracious! What his shock turned to delight as Professor Lupin came in and shut the door behind him. "Ah, Lupin, interesting-looking first lesson you've got going on, eh?" "Need me out of the way," Flitwick, who was so small he could hardly have been in anyone's way ever, made to hop to his feet only to be stopped by a wave from Professor Lupin. "No, no, Professor, that's quite all right. I'd be happy to have you observe the operation." "And I shall be very happy to observe it," squeaked Professor Flitwick, looking pleased as he settled back into his chair. "You've got some very sharp minds in this bunch. Miss Granger, for one, and Mr. Zabini, and both Potters are quite proficient with their spellwork." He shot an encouraging wink at Harry and Violet. "I'd be very excited to have them both in the same class, if I were you. Lucky, lucky." Violet felt the eyes of other students turn toward her and her brother and immediately wanted to vanish herself. It didn't help that Professor Lupin was looking at them as well, smiling appraisingly. Even though his eyes still carried that same kindness Violet had noted on the Hogwarts Express, she couldn't shake the odd warning that Professor Snape had given her only a little while ago. He is not what he seems. "Now then," said Professor Lupin suddenly, beckoning the class toward the end of the room, where there was nothing but an old wardrobe where the teachers kept their spare robes. As Lupin went to stand next to it, the wardrobe gave a sudden wobble, banging off the wall. "Nothing to worry about," said Professor Lupin calmly, because a few people had jumped backward in alarm. "There's a boggart in there." Violet had to disagree this was something to worry about if she remembered her reading correctly. Neville gave Professor Lupin a look of pure terror, and even Malfoy eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. "Boggarts like dark, enclosed spaces," said Professor Lupin. "Wardrobes, the gap beneath beds, the cupboards under sinks. I've even met one that had lodged itself in a grandfather clock. Thistle moved in yesterday afternoon, and I asked the headmaster if the staff would leave it to me to give my third years some practice. So the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a boggart?" Both Violet and Hermione put their hands up. Hermione, however, did not wait to be called upon. "It's a shape-shifter," she said. "It can take the shape of whatever it thinks will frighten us the most." "Couldn't have put it better myself," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. Violet let her hand drop limply to her side with a pout. "So the boggart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a boggart looks like when he is alone, but when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears." "This means," said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, "that we have a huge advantage over the boggart before we begin." "Have you spotted it, Violet?" Trying to answer a question with Hermione in front of her, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet with her hand in the air, was very off-putting, but Violet was fairly certain she knew what answer Lupin was looking for. "Because we're all together, there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it should take." "Precisely," said Professor Lupin, and this time it was Hermione's turn to drop her hand. "It's always best to have company with you're dealing with a boggart. He becomes confused. Which should he become, a headless corpse or a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a boggart make that very mistake, try to frighten two people at once, and turned himself into half a slug. Not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a boggart is simple. yet it requires force of mind. You see, the thing that really finishes a boggart is slaughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. We will practice the charm without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, said the class together. This class is ridiculous, Violet heard Malfoy mutter to Goyle. Good, said Professor Lupin. Very good, but that was the easy part, I'm afraid. You see, the word alone is not enough, and this is where you come in, Neville. Everyone turned to look at Neville Longbottom. The wardrobe shook again, though not as much as he was. After a moment of stillness, Violet feared for a moment he may have fainted, while standing up Neville walked forward as though he were heading for the gallows. Right, Neville, said Professor Lupin. First things first, what would you say is the thing that frightens you most in the world? Neville's lips moved, but no noise came out. Didn't catch that, Neville, sorry, said Professor Lupin cheerfully. Neville looked around rather wildly, as though begging someone to help him, then said, in barely more than a whisper, Professor Snape. Nearly everyone laughed. Even Neville grinned apologetically. Professor Lupin, however, looked thoughtful. Professor Snape. Neville, I believe you live with your grandmother. Yes, said Neville nervously, but I don't want the boggart to turn into her either. No, no, you misunderstand me, said Professor Lupin, now smiling. I wonder, Neville, if you could do something for me. Can you please picture, very clearly in your mind, the sort of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Neville looked startled, but started to say, well, she carries a red handbag. Professor Lupin shushed him gently. We don't need to hear. So long as you see it, we'll see it. Can you see it in your mind's eye? Yes, said Neville uncertainly, plainly wondering what was coming next. Good, said Professor Lupin. Now, what I want you to do is... He leaned in to whisper something into Neville's ear. He was still smiling, though Neville was looking more bewildered than ever at whatever he'd been told. Professor Lupin straightened up and turned back to the rest of the class. If Neville is successful, the boggart is likely to shift his attention to each of us in turn, he said. I would like all of you to take a moment now to think of the thing that scares you most, and imagine how you might force it to look comical. The room went quiet. Violet thought, what scared her most in the world? Her first thought was Lord Voldemort of Voldemort returned to full strength, intent on hunting her and Harry down, and finishing what he'd tried and failed to do to them over 12 years ago. But before she had even started to plan a possible counterattack on a boggart Voldemort, a horrible image came floating to the surface of her mind. A pair of slit yellow eyes, set in the face of a massive, terrible serpent. The very symbol of Slytherin House, with a mouth of fangs as long and sharp as daggers. A sick, lurching realization come far too late, followed by paralysis and then darkness. Endless, mindless, black oblivion. Violet shivered, then looked around, hoping no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight. Harry was looking very pale, and Tracy's face was scrunched up in concentration. Everyone ready, said Professor Lupin. Violet felt a lurch of fear. She wasn't ready. How could you make a basilisk less frightening? But she didn't want to ask for more time. Everyone was nodding and rolling up their sleeves. Neville, we're going to back away, said Professor Lupin. Let you have a clear field, all right. I'll call the next person forward. Everyone back now, so Neville can get a clear shot. They all retreated, backed against the walls, leaving Neville alone beside the wardrobe. He looked pale and frightened, but he had pushed up the sleeves of his robes and was holding his wand ready. On the count of 3, Neville, said Professor Lupin, who was pointing his own wand at the handle of the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3 now. A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin's wand and hit the doorknob. The wardrobe burst open. Hook-nosed and menacing, Professor Snape appeared, his black eyes flashing at Neville. Neville backed away, his wand up, mouthing wordlessly. Snape was bearing down upon him, reaching inside his robes. "Ah, ridiculous," squeaked Neville. There was a noise like a whip crack. Snape stumbled. He was wearing a long, lace-trimmed green dress and a towering hat topped with a moth-eaten vulture, a fox-fur scarf, and from his arm was swinging a huge crimson handbag. There was a roar of laughter. Even Professor Flitwick's stifled chortles could be heard behind them. The boggart paused, confused, and Professor Lupin shouted, "Parvati! Forward!" Parvati Patil, the girl that Violet had pretended to be on the night bus, walked forward, her face set. Snape rounded on her. There was another crack, and where he had stood was a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face was turning to Parvati, and it began to walk toward her very slowly, dragging its feet, its stiff arms rising. "Ridiculous!" cried Parvati. A bandage unraveled at the mummy's feet. It became entangled, fell face forward, and its head rolled off. Harry took an eager step forward, but Seamus, roared Professor Lupin. Seamus darted past Parvati. Crack! Where the mummy had been was a woman with floor-length black hair and skeletal, green-tinged face, a banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and an unearthly sound filled the room. A long, wailing shriek that backed the hair on the back of Violet's neck. "Stand on end. Ridiculous!" shouted Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle, then crack! Became a snarling dog with foam dribbling out of its mouth before crack, becoming a single bloody eyeball. "It's confused," shouted Lupin. "We're getting there, Theodore." Theodore Nut hurried forward. Crack! The eyeball became a severed hand, which flipped over and began to creep along the floor like a crab. "Ridiculous!" yelled Theodore. There was a snap, and the hand was caught in a mousetrap. "Excellent, Ron, you next." Ron leapt forward. Crack! Quite a few people screamed, Tracy loudest among them. A giant spider, 6 feet tall and covered in hair, was advancing on Ron, clicking its pincers menacingly. For a moment, Violet thought Ron had frozen. Then, "Ridiculous!" bellowed Ron, and the spider's legs vanished. It rolled over and over. Tracy squealed and ran out of its way, and it came to a halt at Violet's feet. She raised her wand, ready, but here, shouted Professor Lupin suddenly, hurrying forward. Crack! The legless spider had vanished. For a second, everyone looked wildly around to see where it was. Then they saw a silvery white orb hanging in the air in front of Lupin, who said, "Ridiculous," almost lazily. Crack! "Forward, Neville, and finish him off," said Lupin, as the boggart landed on the floor as a cockroach. Crack! Snape was back. This time Neville charged forward, looking determined. "Ridiculous," he shouted, and they had a split-second's view of Snape in his lacy dress before Neville let out a great "ha" of laughter, and the boggart exploded, burst into 1,000 tiny wisps of smoke, and was gone. "Excellent," cried Professor Lupin as the class broke into applause. "Excellent, Neville. Well done, everyone. Let me see. 5 points for every person to tackle the boggart, 10 for Neville because he did it twice, and 5 each to Hermione and Violet." "But I didn't do anything," said Violet. "You and Hermione answered my questions correctly at the start of the class, Violet," Lupin said lightly. "Very well, everyone. An excellent lesson. Homework, kindly read the chapter on boggarts and summarize it for me, to be handed in on Monday." "That will be all." Talking excitedly, the class left the staff room. Violet, however, wasn't feeling cheerful. Professor Lupin had deliberately stopped her and Harry from taking on the boggart. Why? Was it because he'd seen them collapse on the train and thought they weren't up for it? Had he, though they would pass out again? No one else seemed to have noticed anything. "Did you see that a false spider?" Tracy squeaked, wrapping her arms tightly around herself with a shudder. "Oh, I'm so happy I didn't have to go. I think I might have screamed and embarrassed myself." "You would have been brilliant," Violet muttered, her mind a million miles away as they made their way back to the classroom to collect their bags.